Now, the first meaningful DuPont probably spied on the French for Britain. He had to flee to America during the reign of Napoleon, hooked up with Thomas Jefferson, and started to produce gunpowder. Lots of gunpowder. It was all about profits and risk minimization, while the average American worked hard for a lousy income or fought the wars of the establishment with DuPont gunpowder in their rifles. The family basically ruled Delaware like aristocrats used to rule a principality. So they built castles, they married their own relatives, and expanded the business to chemicals, explosives, and weapons-grade plutonium, thereby poisoning a lot of workers. At some point, their experts calculated that a more stable middle class would bring in more money, and subsequently the wages rose and the workers had more free time to enjoy shiny new cars by GM, which had DuPont backing. Financed through friendly banks running on rubber tires from other companies and gas from Rockefeller's Standard Oil. The DuPont family co-opted some left-wing goals and bought its way into the Democrats and Republicans. And Delaware became an onshore tax haven with offshore qualities, which is why all kinds of companies chose to register there. When Donald Trump visited the state during his 2016 presidential run, he asked one of his minions how many companies he owned there. He thought it must have been a solid handful, but it was hundreds, registered in the same building as some of Hillary Clinton's companies. Now, Joe Biden's political career took off because he looked good on camera and his staff was filled with DuPont lawyers and advisors. Other Democrats complained behind his back that he was even more conservative than the Republicans. He always cared, with all his heart, about the DuPont businesses and credit card companies. Tax avoiding schemes for the rich were welcome, even creative bankruptcy techniques. But the common people were not supposed to get out of credit card debt. The taxpayers remember the tragic cancer death of one of Joe's sons, but they do not remember the many tragic cancer deaths of DuPont employees and those living next to DuPont plants. Joe Biden's son received first-rate medical care, but the other victims, not so much. So, if you look at this closely, it was 378 companies registered in Delaware by Donald Trump and the Trump Organization and so on. There's a really interesting building, the North Orange Street 1209. There's 285,000 companies registered there. It's the home of Apple, American Airlines, Coca-Cola, Walmart, dozens of other companies out of the Fortune 500 list. So there's a whole lot of stuff you can do with this. You can split up your company, you register it in Delaware, and you put things that cost money, you put them somewhere else, and things that get you money, you put somewhere else. And you do license fees and all kind of stuff, so you don't really pay that many taxes. So, then you had some family scandals of the DuPonts. There was some child molestation that got a conviction for that. And you had senators from the family. T. Coleman and Henry A. DuPont, they became senators. Pierre S. DuPont IV served as governor of Delaware. And they put their people everywhere, right? Not just in Delaware, but mostly in Delaware. So, Joe Biden, he became an important figure over time with the DuPonts behind him. Pierre DuPont, he wanted to become president of the United States in 1988, but then you saw George H.W. Bush ultimately take the presidency. So, the DuPonts have roughly 1,600 living family members. 250 of those belong to the inner circle, it is estimated, and about 50 comprise the executive level of the clan. Together, they have around $211 billion of assets, 24 palaces, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, uses Delaware to create front companies and to hide certain activities. And there was one incident where those activities were could be traced back to the DuPonts. So this was the 1980s. The CIA was preparing these small airplanes to use them as fighter planes in Nicaragua against the Sandinista communists. And so the American press traced back these planes to shell companies in Panama, and behind those you had shell companies of the CIA. And many of those CIA shell companies were registered in Delaware. And Joe Biden at the time was a U.S. senator, and he was also in the Intelligence Committee, and he was creating a lot of noise, and he said he was going to get to the bottom of this, but of course he really didn't. So this was this one company in particular was interesting, a company called Summit Aviation. Summit Aviation was converting planes into fighter planes. And the president of Summit was Richard C. DuPont. It's really interesting. And yeah, and this goes into, this has some interesting connections into other scandals. The Iran-Contra scandal. You can read into that thing. Yeah, and then the origins of the DuPont clan are very interesting. So it was the 1700s, and Britain and France really hated each other, right? And there was a lot of espionage going on, and I have the sneaking suspicion that the DuPonts, or the first meaningful DuPont, spied for Britain against the French. And this went on for quite some time, and this one particular DuPont, he was close to the French throne, so he could potentially get all kinds of interesting information and relay those bits of information. And so, yeah, Pierre Samuel DuPont, he had eyes and ears in France, and at some point he had to leave France when Napoleon was in power. So the DuPonts packed up their stuff. They went to the United States, and this was not an easy journey. It was not an easy journey. And once they arrived in the United States, they had the trust of Thomas Jefferson, and then the DuPonts made a lot of money with gunpowder. A lot of money with gunpowder. So at some point, people became very, very aware of the DuPont clan and very critical of the DuPont clan, especially after the First World War. The war created a lot of new millionaires in the United States. And so certain banks and families and companies, they helped each other out to make even more money. And the more money the DuPonts made, the more they put into media and politics, and they tried to get some sort of control, which is not surprising that this happened. And at some point, the DuPonts figured out, if we pay people more money and give them more free time, they will buy our products, and we make even more money. So that was how that went. And then we had the Smedley Butler affair, which is really interesting. So this was United States Marine Corps General, retired Smedley Butler. So he was kind of a military hero, and he had to step down once he criticized Mussolini. Right? He called Mussolini crazy. And at some point, General Butler retired. He got a visitor, and that visitor was really strange, and he talked about the threat of socialism and the need for drastic measures. So the proposal was to get Butler involved with a group, and that group had financial backing, and they could mobilize 500,000 people, roughly 500,000 people, and they would march on Washington, D.C. and these people would have rifles with DuPont gunpowder, essentially. And they pitched this idea to him that this show of force would lead to a peaceful transition of power. So this wasn't supposed to be a shooting war or a violent revolution, just a show of force, a show of power, and then a nice right-wing transition. So Butler wasn't buying it. He pretended to be interested, but then he alerted the authorities, and this became sort of a scandal, right? And at that time, the DuPonts and other families like them, they put a lot of money into veterans organizations, military organizations, right-wing media, even some conspiratorial media. And so it was... So this, of course, triggered the left wing, and the left wing was pretty agitated over this. And so, but the upper class, kind of these rich families, they try to keep the balance in America, so to speak. They try to keep a certain left-right balance. So this was not just financing right-wing organizations, it's also about financing left-wing organizations. So how real was this offer to Smedley Butler, right? Here's a bunch of organizations supported by the DuPont family: the khaki shirts, blue shirts, white band, nationalists, silver shirt, American Guard magazine from the Swastika Press, Southern Committee to Uphold the Constitution, the Crusaders, the Minutemen, and the Anti-Semitic Sentinels of the Republic, and on and on and on. So they basically claimed we represent anti-communism and we want to save America. But it was never really about saving America. It was never really about making everything conservative. It was just to keep people busy, to string them along. And General Butler, he gave his statements and he told what he knew about this plot. But the press was treating this as one big hoax, one big fake. They basically said Butler was crazy. Butler, he received the Medal of Honor twice, which is super rare. The Brevet Order, Medal of Honor, and so on and so on and so on. And who was this Butler guy? So he was a military guy who was very successful, and he thought he was defending America's interests in Central America, the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. But at some point, he realized these were banana wars. This was just wars to support American companies, like the United Fruit Company. And Butler became disillusioned, and he wrote a book about this with the title War is a Racket. And in this short little booklet, he tells a story about all these millionaires all these people who became millionaires by profiting off of World War I. And so none of these business people were fighting in the war. They didn't suffer in the war. They didn't have to do all this. And Butler, he's even talking about the DuPont family in this booklet. So he says, well, these guys they had to make statements about their money and what they were doing and whom they were selling gunpowder to. And they made so much money off of World War II. Lots of money, but also other companies. And Butler names these companies. And so, yeah, there was some people who made a lot of money with the war. And it was also pretty shabby how little soldiers got paid. So after taxes and other things, a soldier was left with $9 per month. And then soldiers were pressured into buying Liberty bonds of the government, which indirectly was paying for the guns and ammunition, which soldiers used. And yeah, and that was the Butler scandal. So it's possible that maybe the DuPont family tried to entrap him. Maybe they tried to just figure him out, make an offer if he was maybe willing to do something like that or consider something like that. Maybe they just wanted to know where he was at. And in reality, Smedley Butler was not trusting the DuPonts. They was not trusting any of those rich people. Yeah, then it was some interesting Nazi business of the DuPonts, and like several companies, powerful companies from the U.S. It was some really, really shady Nazi business, and then this business stopped, and then of course companies like DuPont or GM or Rockefeller Standard Oil, they switched, and then they exclusively supported the American war effort. So yeah, you're really dealing with a DuPont president, right? So you really have to look into the history of that clan, and you can't just follow certain influencers and think Joe Biden is an asset of the Chinese or he's an asset of some left-wing deep state. It's if you study the history of the older empires, the kingdoms and the principalities and the aristocracy, if you go into that, you realize that this is a family-based ideology. So it's just about their own kind, it's just about their own power, and it's not Marxist what they do for them with themselves. They can use Marxism, but they can also use any other ideology they want. And that's kind of the problem, right? So, especially in the 1700s and 1800s, you saw the end of serfdom in Europe. So, my ancestors in Europe, they had a 90% probability that they were farming serfs. 90% of people were farming serfs, and a serf is sort of an 85 to 90% slave, right? It's not a full slave, but pretty close. And at some point, that slavery wasn't efficient enough anymore. So these aristocracies, they figured out if they allow more wealth in the population, they allow more knowledge in the population, and if you control that through intelligence services, then you get more money, then you get more power. And so you saw the end of serfdom, and the average person during serfdom, they of course wanted something else. They wanted freedom, and that's why you saw the Enlightenment movement, that's why you saw early socialism, and of course the aristocracy treated those movements as treasonous. And what happens next? Of course, secret police, intelligence services infiltrated those movements, the Enlightenment movement and early socialism and others. And this infiltration became so pronounced that at some point the aristocracy had control over these movements. And so you have to look at history from an intelligence standpoint, and the most powerful clans, they of course could create these ideological movements that we now know today, and they can control all kinds of ideological movements. So you're allowed to pick one of the ideologies available, one of those standardized ideologies. You can be a libertarian, you can be left-wing, you can be right-wing, you can be more in the center, you can be a conspiracy buff, a traditional conspiracy buff, but all of these movements are essentially under control. The main narratives are under control. And of course, it's designed in a fashion so that people fight each other, and they don't really, they can't really realize their own interests because they're too busy fighting each other. So we're going to look more and more into Joe Biden and the DuPont family and other people in his cabinet, but it's standard Anglo-American empire material, right? So it doesn't help your cause if you're a conservative it doesn't help your cause if you just follow certain narratives and you say Joe Biden is a Chinese agent and the Chinese stole the American election and that sort of stuff. It really doesn't help your cause.